Great. Well, we'll kick off again. All of the speakers that we have over the course of the weekend are, of course, fascinating. But I think what you're about to listen to now will conjure up the genius loci of this place more powerfully than anything else. And we're really, really pleased that Mike MacCarthy Morrough has come back and come back for the first time since his family left the estate. But their time here, the MacCarthy Morroghs in Innis, what they were on their arrival, the experiences, the impression they've left both here and on the wider area, are all topics that some of us will have heard something about over the years. Some of us may have read Mike's work in the Skibbereen and District Historical Journal and in other organs of record, but I don't think anyone has ever heard this in this form, and certainly not in this place. So we're really, really delighted to have Mike, who is himself, although he's too modest to say it, a historian of real note. Many of you will no doubt have read his book on the Munster Plantation, which was a classic, and I think still is, although he is too, as I say, too self-effacing to confess it. But he's also probably better placed than anyone else to talk about the MacCarthy Morroghs and their arrival here in the 19th century. So, Mike, over to you.
Yes, this is a very self-indulgent talk, I'm afraid, because people love talking about their families. I'm going to do that. It's really very local, as Simon was saying, and it's the coincidence of the festival's venue here, which encouraged him to invite me to talk on this. So therefore, if there are any evasions or errors in this scholarly paper, I'm going to have to disappoint you. There's no attempt to compare, contrast other examples of families which came here, you see. It's just my lot. But it does rely heavily on a primary source. And the primary source is the unpublished letters and diaries of Edith Somerville. Now, there's no need to introduce this local genius. Somerville and Ross wrote the Real Charlotte in 1894, which after Ulysses is commonly regarded as the best book, best novel, best Irish novel. And she wrote, of course, other novels after the death of Martin Ross, as well as the RM stories. And I think I'm going to look at some of those other novels, which are going to illustrate parts of it. Music, 1919, and Enthusiast, 1921. I think they're very underrated. And I think they're very interesting. She's writing about events, current events at her time. And she mentions the Morroghs in a moment, as I describe it. There are lots of letters and diaries are, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Letters and diaries are mostly in Queen's University, Belfast, but there's some also in Trinity, Dublin. And I've trawled through them, and I don't think, I may be wrong here, but I don't think local historians have looked enough at these. I mean, some of the letters have been published before Martin's death, and they're the letters which are currently in New York. But I think it's an underused source, but I might be wrong. Anyhow, our family, the MacCarthy Morroghs or Morroghs, are frequently mentioned in her papers, as well as being the models, I would argue, for the uncouth McRory family in the RM stories. And some of them, Ross, are notoriously, they were very casual about using real characters in their stories. There's no doubt about that. Although Edith did deny this, but I think there are many, many similarities between the vulgar, moneyed McRorys in 5 of the RM stories and the Morroghs. And there's Edith who provides the title for this talk. When my grandfather died in 1932, Edith writes in a letter to her brother that no one knows what will happen to Inishbeg. One could view the final departure of all Morroghs from the county with equanimity. No amount of shaving stops the growth of hair on their heels. Which I think is superb, haute de bas. But it's simplistic to dub Somerville and Ross, or some of it, Edith Somerville, simply as social snobs, because we're all snobs. in one way or another. And they're writers, remember. And authors have to place their characters socially in order to see them. And Cruz O'Brien wrote a very good article many years ago in Writers and Politics, so in the 1950s. And he said that they had to actually sort of place characters in order to see them. For example, Protestant lower middle class, stuck, or gentleman run wild with touch of brogue, or Catholic middle class, moving up, which produces an unembarrassed grading of human beings. Well, the Morroghs, soon to become MacCarthy Morroghs, in the mid-19th century, came here from Cork City in the mid-19th century. And they bought this island in 1829. And I don't know why, because it had been in Driscoll territory, of course, the lordship, and then English did arrive in the 17th century. Not the Munster Plantation, by the way. The Munster Plantation did not affect this area. And it's a puzzle why they landed here in West Cork. Lots of Cork merchants bought houses and lands in the early to mid-19th century, rather than Cork City, rather than in Cork City. An English traveller in 1835 was struck how few streets in Cork have the appearance of being inhabited by the upper classes. One cause of this is that a large number of the merchants live out of town. The passion for country houses in Cork is universal. Now, the Morroghs, the Cork City family, and the intertwined MacCarthys outside, of course, Cork City, bought houses in North Cork, helped by the incumbent estates court with its low prices following the famine. But James Morrough, who had houses in North Cork and Cork City, evidently hankered after something more exotic. Somehow or other, Islo-mania managed to affect him, which Lawrence Durrell defines as a disease as yet unclassified by medical science, concerning people who find islands irresistible. And you can find this throughout the world. I mean, there are sort of Caribbean islands occupied by disgraced financiers like Jacob Epstein or royal riffraff and so on. And people do like islands, don't they? Even disgraced politicians, maybe like Charles, the Basket Islands and so on. So it's quite interesting that this, obviously, Islomania managed to infect James Morrough. And I don't know why, because the Morroghs weren't from this area in West Cork. They're from North Cork. Well, Cork City for the Morroghs, MacCarthy's from North Cork, and when they combined together, they've got places in North Cork. So he must have taken a trip down here, seen that the island was for sale. It was Church of Ireland property at that time. And Islomania made him buy it. He succumbed to the fever. Then, of course, once they're here, they have to infiltrate the local gentry. Now, how are they going to do that? And I'm going to take it seriatim. Did they try and sound like them? Did they go to the same sort of schools? Did they follow the same pursuits, same games, the same sports? Did they follow the same career options? Did they shun the forbidden career options? Did they subscribe to the West Cork gentry's prevalent political unionism? And did they try and copy the prevalent Anglo-Irish fashion at the time to establish themselves as an ancient family and get into the genealogical record books? And finally, a significant question, did their Catholicism, Morroghs and MacCarthy Morroghs were Catholic, did their Catholicism prevent or set limits to their acceptance by the surrounding gentry? In short, did they broadly ape the Anglo-Irish, or did they try and change them? Now, one obvious step is to look and sound like the local gentry, and that meant actually speaking with an English accent, not a brogue, so an English accent. I find the whole business of accents fascinating, actually. You know, everyone keeps off it. It's regarded as kind of an embarrassing topic. But I think it is interesting and revealing in some ways. There's a strange sort of delicacy about accents. Now, speaking with the right accent, usually at this time, meant attending a certain school. And the Morrough boys were all sent to an English boarding school, Jesuit boarding school, Stonyhurst. Now, they could have been sent to Clongowes, which, of course, is the top Jesuit school outside Dublin. And they could have got, a Jesuit education there for practically half the price. So why do they choose to send them to Stonyhurst? Well, I think the answer is partly to do with accent. It's as simple as that. And the nationalist writer D.P. Moran, the man who talks about Chonines and so on, put his finger on it with bruising simplicity. He said, at English public schools, they are taught an accent. And that consideration takes the hearts of the papas and the mamas in the villages of Leinster, Munster, and Connaught. Now, Kieran O'Neill, in his book Catholics of Consequence, mentions that the tradition of the Cork City merchant princes schooling in England is believed to have contributed to the distinctive Montenotte accent associated with suburban wealth. I don't know if this is true or not. We can talk about that later. There was a large family, the Morroghs, who came down here. And eventually James MacCarthy Morrogh, who was the son of the James Morrough who bought this place, had 15 children. 13 survived infancy. And 8 of them were boys, and they were all sent to Stonyhurst in England. And the 5 girls were sent, the 2 eldest, to Mount Anville for a little bit, but then on to convents in England, Roehampton, which is a high-octane Catholicism stuff. I don't know if any of you read Frost in May by Antonia White, but if you want to read a novel about the power of nuns in the convent, read Frost in May, which is set in Roehampton. They went to Roehampton. And then the younger girls were sent to convents in not just England, but Belgium and Germany. So the MacCarthy Morroghs spoke like proper English gentlemen, although that wasn't quite as far as was recommended for some people in this area. Because around Castle Townsend, that strange place, hot with gentry in the local parlance, some of the people in Castle Townsend had a most extraordinary drawl, the sort of haw-haw, long A sounds from the barely open mouths of cavalry officers in smart regiments. You get this in Punch cartoons and so on. And the Morroghs might have been expected to try and copy that, but that was going a bit too far, because even Edith Somerville ridicules the local Church of Ireland vicar, the Reverend Harry Beecher, well-known family, Anglo-Irish family here, in her diary about this. And she says, one sermon began, an officer said to me, an O-off, she spells it O-off, an officer said to me that in this parish, and so the MMs, the MacCarthy Morroghs, shared Edith's ridicule of this affectation, and both teased the Somervilles of Park Cottage, Union Hall, and they dubbed them the Porks. Porks like pigs, but porks from the strangulated sound of park. They go, there's we're from Park. I don't know if this draw was particular to the West Cork gentry. I'm quite interested in this, you see. But Lady Carberry from England, now married, and of course at Castle Freak near Roscarby, to the east from us, was surprised to be called Lady Corbury. And her butler was asked her, can you bring my core? And so she was surprised by this too. I think it may have been just a Castle Townsend accent. While the Morroghs didn't suffer from this languid A affliction, they sounded like the surrounding gentry who spoke received pronunciation and not with the brogue. There could be 2 or 3 exceptions. The eldest son, Bertie, who came from Stonyhurst and didn't really retire to Innisbeg to live out his days as a half-sir hunting, yachting and partying, could well have possessed a light brogue, because in one of the RM stories, Curly McRory, I would suggest, and I've got reasons for this, I think, modelled on Bertie Morrow, has a besotted young English woman imitating him. Following upon this, Sybil took to saying, I will, in what she believed to be a brogue instead of yes. So Bertie Morrow might have had an Irish accent. The Morroghs could put on an Irish accent. They're quite good mimics. And Edith Somerville herself was a very good mimic. But it would have been a put-on accent. It wouldn't have been their natural accent, which would have been English sounding. Now, education, of course, abroad meant money. That needed money. The Morroghs had been merchants in Cork City with varying success, but the real injection of capital came from Alexander MacCarthy, a butter merchant who'd made a pile victualling the British forces during the Napoleonic Wars. And James MacCarthy Morrough, he'd inherited various MacCarthy bequests when they died off without children, in the 1890s had an income of perhaps £4,000 a year. And that was quite a large sum. This is at a time when a Dublin policeman's annual salary was £75. A national school teacher got £82. That's £48 if female. So to the West Cork gentry, this sum branded the Morroghs as comparatively rich, but nouveau riche, the ultimate crime. In the RM stories, old McRory is described as a retired Dublin coal merchant with an enormous family and a reputation for great riches. Now, a retired Dublin coal merchant is not a million miles away from a Cork butter merchant, it seems to me. Whereas the Anglo-Irish, the gentry, the encrusted gentry who are here already, had their wealth, of course, from land. They were landed, not trade. Nevertheless, these Cork City Aravistes did start to wriggle their way into West Cork society. Of the McRoys in the RM stories, this is the narrator, the RM saying, the family had worn its way unequally and in patches into the tolerance of the neighbourhood. It was said, apologetically, the daughters danced and played tennis and golf so well, and the sons did the same and were such excellent shots, that Mrs. McRory bought, uncomplainingly, all that was offered to her at bazaars, and could be counted on for a whole row of seats at local concerts. As for old McRory, people said he was rather awful, but he was better than his family in that he knew he was awful and kept out of the way. The eldest son, Curly McRory, was perhaps the pioneer of his family in their advance across what has usefully been called the boundary dashed line. Bounder, cad, boundary line. I've never heard that expression before, but it's used in the RM stories. In her private papers, Somerville frequently refers to James MacCarthy Morrough, the patriarch of the family here at Innis, as Old Morrow. It does seem he was a reserved, stolid, reticent man, rarely stirring from the island, but his children certainly joined in the sports beloved by the gentry. Endless tennis parties at the various houses, including Innis. In Victoria times, the court was near the entrance to the orchard. So when you come back of the Gogane, have a look at the orchard, just north of the orchard towards the house, that's where the tennis court was. But it was plagued by creepy crawlies and flies and so on. And so a new court was laid out in front of the house, where the sunken garden is, I think, at the moment. Cricket was even played on Innis. Most people went to Innis to play cricket, writes Edith Somerville in 1899. Don't know where that was. It's probably one of the top fields, I think. Shooting parties were regular things, and many of the girls had rifles themselves and were good shots, particularly targeting rabbits. Some sports, however, needed a substantial outlay, so the family's wealth came into use here. Yachts were bought for at least 3 of the sons, being kept at Baltimore, Dirinatra, which is between Ballytub and Skull, somewhere quite Rossbryn, and occasionally upriver here. My grandfather kept his yacht, actually most of the time, down the far end of the island, so he could sail down. In the boathouse here, we're not quite in the boathouse is just there. In the boathouse here were the smaller craft, and then right alongside this stone building, round about where we are here, was a timber hangar which housed a motor launch which could slide down runners into the river. And when I was young, we could see this thing which is falling down. And you could see actually the runners, which are made of wood, which the launch would glide down into the river. My father sold this in the late 1930s, but the remnants of the second boathouse could still be seen after the war. Relations between the Morrow brothers on the water was not always amicable. In her notebooks, Edith Somerville recorded an anecdote of Dennis's exploits, perhaps with the idea of working it up as an RM story. And she writes this: Dinny Morrow, that's Dennis, Dinny Morrow and brothers are in Baltimore on a day of regatta in a small yacht. Before the regatta begins, they have a row. Dinny jumps, or is knocked out of the boat, into the water and swims ashore. He goes to a public house, orders 6 bottles of whiskey, and finding the committee of the regatta in the snug, offers them whiskey in mugs. He's immediately elected president of the regatta. I like to have read that story. An important social contact was made by hunting, earning the approval of Edith Somerville, the sometime MFH. The Morroghs came out regularly for the hunt, and that was to be celebrated and aided their infiltration campaign, even if Edith's comments were not always complimentary. These are some of her comments. Daisy Morrow's pony running away, of course, till happily she fell into a drain. The youngest of the Morrow daughters was Rita, Margarita, also known as Baby. Now, in an early draft of the RM stories, the McRory daughter about to take up hunting was Baby McRory. Baby Morrow started to go out with the West Carberry, going well, but sometimes incensing Edith. Horrid little Rita Morrow on the mad chestnut pony was so well up that I had to give her the pack, but she didn't deserve it, being very impudent to me when I rebuked her for cutting in and other enormities. If someone would hamstring her pony or herself and keep them at home, I should be truly grateful. Now, I've looked at the manuscript copies of the RM stories, which are at Trinity, Dublin, and I looked at them with the hope, of course, that he was going to, by mistake, say Morrow and then cross it out and put McRory. And this happens, I mean, if you look at, I haven't looked at this myself, but it's a well-known occasion. It's true. Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. There is a moment in Brideshead Revisited where he writes, actually, instead of Sebastian, he writes Alistair. Alistair Graham was a friend of his youth at Oxford, and Sebastian was clearly modelled on Alistair. So he writes Alistair and crosses out and puts Sebastian back in. So I was rather hoping that there'd be McRory, or Morrow rather, crossed out, the McRory put back in. But damn it, it isn't, and I've got no proof. Entering the hunting world was comparatively easy. The entrance from any background was always welcome. You just needed the wherewithal for money for a horse. But the MacCarthy Morroghs would score extra points, though, by giving hunt meals at Innisbeg here and inviting the hunt to the island. Edith does remark, however, on the inappropriately lavish luncheons at Innisbeg, going over the top, striving too hard. And there's another link here with the McRoys in the story, Sharper Than a Ferret's Tooth, where Major Yeats, the RM, the resident magistrate, his wife and friends are rescued from a boating accident. And Edith actually in the diaries says, we went to Innisbeg in 1879 and then had to go out in a boat and see that singularly uninteresting place, Cree, just across the water there. But going back to the story, there's shipwreck that the RM and his party are sort of shipwrecked, as it were, and are fulsomely welcomed to the McRory's house. There they're given dry clothes, a large meal and entertainment. The narrator and his wife gasp at the profusion of clothes offered. We had a choice of about 80 silk blouses, breathed Philippa, and struggled manfully with an eccentric and drink-laced luncheon. The idea is, I think we're supposed to feel that the Morrows are vulgar with their generosity and over the top. Time could be spent on hunting, as the Morrow girls and some of the boys didn't have anything so improper as a local job. The point about a boarding school education, of course, is to prepare sons for the professions, medicine, law, the civil service and the military. Most of these, quite a lot of them certainly, to be pursued in the empire. And this is exactly what happened to the Morrow boys. Two of them became doctors, two of them became military men. The doctors and the military men all served in Africa. The doctors, two of them were doctors, and when our resident magistrate saw McRory buying cigarettes in Skiborn, which is Skibbereen, clearly, quote, I was informed it was one of the young McRorys, a medical student and a bit of a lad, but nothing at all to the next one. Another son was trained as a lawyer, and after a shaky start in Skibbereen and Cork, found a better haven in Dublin. The remaining two sons were dispatched to settle in the colonies. One was sent to Australia, the other one to New Zealand. Both met up again at Gallipoli, and the Australian was killed there. So the Morrow career is very much par for the course. A lot of service in the empire. You go to a public school, come back, you may go to university. Only a couple of them went to university in Trinity, but then you go out to the empire. Nothing untoward there. And the same true of their politics, really. What little they expressed. The prevailing opinion among the gentry in West Cork was unsurprisingly unionist. Edith Somerville, claimed by Gifford Lewis, I think, in a good biography, but claimed to be sort of nationalist, and certainly there were nationalist feelings of later on as the revolution progressed. But to begin with, she was certainly unionist, and Violet Martin Ross, Violet Martin, was very unionist. She goes over to campaign for Liberal Unionists in 1894 and 1895 in England. The butter merchant, the origin of this wealth, Alexander MacCarthy, was apolitical, I assume. I mean, he christened his second son Nelson, who was born in 1805, the year of the Admiral's death. So I'm assuming, that he approved of that. But his eldest son was a nationalist MP for Cork City and Cork County, relatively briefly in the 1840s and 1850s. He was one of O'Connell's Repeal Association MPs. He made a slight name with a ringing nationalist speech in 1846, but his nephew, that's James MacCarthy Morrough, who acted as his secretary, little, if any, nationalist sympathies rubbed off on him. Because once he was ensconced at Innisbeg here, he drifted into passive unionism, really, a castle Catholic. D.P. Moran would say Shoneen. Comments from two of his sons, evidently trying to ingratiate themselves, demonstrate that the family were not supporters of Home Rule. However, the English, you might have thought, well, obviously they've had an English education, so they wouldn't be supporters, and at Stonyhurst you wouldn't get supporters of Home Rule. But that's not true, because no less than 5 of Parnell's MPs who have been at Stonyhurst were Home Rulers. There's quite an interesting book written by Ima O'Duffy called The Wasted Island. I don't know if anyone's read this book, but it's published first in 1919. Then he rewrote it in 1929. And he writes about his time at Stonyhurst. And he says this: history lessons at Stonyhurst were a dull tale with England as hero, the rest of Europe as vassals, and France the villain of the piece. At this time, there was one subject which Bernard, that's quite clearly Ima O'Duffy, remained in complete ignorance, that of his native land. He regarded himself as British and his island as Britain. And I think the MacCarthy Morrough boys, who are resolutely unacademic, would have adopted and remained pretty well in this position. But in the sixth form, Bernard, that's Ima O'Duffy, begins to think independently, reads radical literature, and calls himself a socialist. This then shades into Irish nationalism. He makes friends with an unusual nationalist Irish boy at Stonyhurst, Austin Mallow, who refers to Bernard as a rotten West Briton. Now, Mallow could loosely be inspired by Joseph Plunkett. I didn't realize this until fairly recently. But Joseph Plunkett spent a couple of years at Stonyhurst, one of the signatories, of course, of 1916. So it was possible to go the other way. Although he'd been educated at this boarding school in England, it was possible to become a nationalist. But not the Morrows, I think. The Morrows just took the prevailing line, which was unionist. In 1877, James MacCarthy Morrough, the man here, gives his servants shillings to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee. He had a servants' book, which he had 2 households, one here in Innisbeg and another one Dundera near Kinsale. And he had 228 servants over about 50 years. And he writes little comments and epithets about them. And it's really quite interesting. But it indicates he wasn't really a cultural nationalist, particularly. He gives them shillings to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee in 1887, as I've said. Doesn't give them anything in 1897, though. Perhaps it's changing. But anyhow, he does comment upon his coachman in 1904, who was spent his time learning Irish in place of cleaning up kitchen and room. Bad news. There were various cultural gestural acceptances of the fashionable Celtic revival at this time, one of them being the adoption of the Irish spelling for Innisbeg. Instead of being phonetically Innisbeg, they thought the Irish was I-double-N-I-S. Of course, it's I-N-1-S. So they misspelled it, but they wanted to become more Irish slightly. There was also a push to get to the Burke's landed gentry of Ireland. This is the Bible of record for the Anglo-Irish, particularly the CT set, the Castle Townsend set. Really important, which had set a sort of reverence for genealogy and long and prestigious family trees, often involving what Gifford Lewis, who writes this very good biography of Edith Somerville, calls elements of hopeful fiction. But now was the fashionable thing for Gaelic inclusion. And the MacCarthy Morroghs immediately leapt at this chance, of course. Because in 1912, the editor, I've read the 1912 edition of Burke's, when the Morroghs first started to appear. He says this, he summarizes this new fad, the editor. He says, of course, one knows that every Irishman is the descendant of countless kings, princes, and other minor celebrities. One knows, of course, also that every family is the oldest in County Galway or County Sligo or somewhere else, and that for some reason or other, every Irishman is the head of his family. The upward climbing McRorys couldn't gain admittance at first, but with some sleight of hand, the MacCarthy Morroghs too, because they managed to link themselves with the MacCarthys in the mists of time. And once you've done that, you're there. So the Celtic revival was accepted to a certain extent, as I've said, and the family would sing Percy French songs. I don't know if people still sing Percy French songs. It's exactly the sort of thing that the gentry would do. Not rebel songs, good Lord no, but Percy French songs were okay. And Annie MacCarthy Morrough, James's wife, was an accomplished singer and joined the gentry in singing at Skibbereen, charity concerts and so on. However, though, Annie was involved in a big scandal in the early 1890s when James intended to bring a divorce action against her. This is his wife who'd borne 15 children. A divorce action against her for adultery, despite the family being Catholic. This excited West Cork society, and indeed Cork City too. The details heavily salacious, enjoyed by many, but it was compromised out of court to the disappointment of the newspapers. The family continued living at Innisbeg, but she was separated and went to live in London. But James MacCarthy Morrough suffered a lack of social confidence from this, however, might have been drummed up by the city's social elite. Not only the hall porter, but the manager of the Imperial Hotel in Cork was sacked because they'd provided helpful evidence against Annie MacCarthy Morrough. Is Imperial still around? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah, it's on Patrick Street, maybe? Was it? I can't remember. The Mall, somehow. But yes, we used to sort of go there. But so the manager was sacked because he'd blabbed about what was happening at that hotel. And her husband might have found it difficult to show his face again at the club. Now this, according to Nora Robertson, and we heard I mentioned it in the earlier talk, Nora Robertson, she says this: the county club at Cork was even more given to blackballs than Kildare Street. The ineligibles, mostly Roman Catholic business folk, or anyone whose loyalty was suspect, joined the City Club. And Ian Dalton writes, in fact, of the blackballing of city merchants who dared to put themselves up for election to the Cork County Club in the 1830s. And I think it was a close-run thing. I think James MacCarthy Morrough might well have been blackballed or excluded after this, great scandal. But he does survive. But his confidence was badly shaken, I think. He did think of leaving the county. He thought of leaving County Cork, or even living in Ireland. But in the end, continued his misanthropic existence at Innisbeg. So he continued living here. One of his sons reassured him, "You will be able to live as secluded at Innisbeg as in the Rocky Mountains." Another son, this is Bertie, actually, who was living at Innisbeg, echoed this: "If privacy is your desire, there's no place equal to this." Yet the MacCarthy Morroghs weren't cancelled socially in West Cork. Their eldest daughter, Christine, married in 1895 at the Pro Cathedral in Skibbereen, officiated by the Bishop of Ross and 2 other priests, and that was followed by a day of entertainment here at Innisbeg. Edith Somerville's diary says, "Very big breakfast in the marquee." Probably wasn't as nice as the Octagon marquee, but very big breakfast in a marquee. Everybody there in thousands. They went away at 4:30. We got off soon afterwards. The house wasn't actually finished in 1895 because the house had started to be built in the 1890s and then stopped because of this projected divorce, and then sort of continued in stages. And so they actually had to change in what was called the wooden house, which is a kind of dacha, but no longer there. The Skibbereen Eagle, clearly on a slow news day, devoted a full page to this brilliant and fashionable marriage. Now, Christine had married an army officer, Captain Cumming. And this is practically the only escape route for daughters of the gentry at this time. They're sort of suffered to kind of remain in their family home. It's about like Chekhov or Jane Austen, until somebody carried them off. Molly Keane, the author, says, "Girls didn't go away or get jobs. They stayed in the family until they were married." So 2 other sisters, not just Christine, but 2 other sisters also married army officers, Captain Carden and Castle Maxwell, although there occurs a difficulty here, which would not affect the Anglo-Irish of their class, and that's religion. Carden was an implacable Protestant, wrote a frank letter to James MacCarthy Morrogh claiming he couldn't marry his fiancée May until she abandoned her religion, which she did, to the disappointment of her father, though happily relations were not broken, and Carden acted as an executor for the old man's will. So religion is a subject which can't be avoided. The single element of discord that remained ever unchanged was religion. That's a quote from Mount Music. Did their religion, the fact they were Catholic, damage their acceptance by the Anglo-Irish here? Now, in 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville, that marvelous account of his journey to Ireland, interviews a Protestant lawyer, and he asks him, question, but is there not a natural tendency for a Catholic who becomes rich to mix with the aristocracy? Answer, they would often like to, but cannot do it. I am sorry to say that people close the ranks against them. The Protestants cannot get used to seeing them on a footing of equality with themselves. And that might have been so in the turbulent 1830s. But it's quite clear, it seems to me, by the later 19th century, there's a much greater toleration prevailing. It's clear that bigotry is going out of fashion. You could be accused of it. You didn't like it. It's a bit like sort of racism or sexism today. So bigotry is not something which is, projected. Anglo-Irish Protestants were sensitive to any accusations made publicly. The MacCarthy Morroghs were not slow to pitch in against any perceived Protestant prejudice. They objected to a landowner banning the hunt for one day because, as his telegram to the MFH ran, he would not have a Roman Catholic rabble overrunning my Ross. These are the Townsend and my Ross. That was according to two Morrough daughters. But on investigating, Edith Somerville discovered that the precise telegram was dislike rabble through woods on Roman Catholic holiday. Edith comments, bad enough, but not as bad as the Morrough version. Edith Somerville thought the MacCarthy Morroghs were unnecessarily combative. When a British Army officer proposed taking over the West Carbery hunt as MFH in 1909, she was supportive. They are RCs, they are RCs, but that doesn't matter. Brackets, though I fear the Morroghs will fill them up with lies as they did the Lindows. Mount Music, this is this novel I think do recommend you to read. It's not sort of popular, it's not a very great novel, but it's very interesting indeed because it approaches the sectarian question head on and is open about the prejudice on both sides and is equally satirical and observant. One of the leading characters is Larry Coppinger, member of the gentry, but brought up as a Catholic and sent to the Jesuits at Stonyhurst. Back home in West Cork, this produced a certain frisson. Quoting from the novel, Larry was beginning for the first time, and not without displeasure, to realize something of the social complications that are involved by the difference of creed. It's a matter of atmosphere, quite intangible and quite perceptible. Larry was discovering he was something of an anomaly. Only an RC by accident, as he heard someone say, in apparent extenuation of malevolence he found irritating. He was learning the meaning of the sudden silences, the two obvious changes in the course of conversation that seemed to occur when he drew near. Yet accusations of sectarianism were frowned upon, particularly from the repentant gentry side. The novel's very good on Catholic bigotry too. She's very good on sort of Catholic clerics and the sort of, pleasure they have of the fact that they're with the movement and so on. But between themselves, though, so the novel is critical of bigotry. However, between themselves, the West Cork gentry did still harbour reservations about Catholics, the RCs as they call them, especially when it came to mixed marriages. There's a terrible moment when one of the CT said, the Castle Townsend said, that Sylvia Townsend, described by Gifford Lewis as CT's most high-powered man-chaser, might have married a Morrow. That's Denny Morrow. This caused consternation. And it's consternation because he was Catholic, but also he was training to be a local solicitor. I pity Harry with his daughter wanting to marry a Skibbereen attorney. Denny Morrow might even have penetrated the tightly Protestant gentry enclave of CT itself by buying Tally Ho, one of the big houses there. But Castle Townsend is very strange, isn't it? It's got about a dozen or 13 big houses all the way down the street. I think it's unique in Ireland. The gentry normally have big houses scattered around the country, but they're all, anyhow. One of the big houses there, luckily for Edith, her sister and husband, Egerton Coghill, bought it instead. It would have been intolerable if Dinny Morrow or any other outsider got it. In fact, Dinny Morrow married little Miss Mary Murphy from the brewing dynasty. Good move, that. Protestants were often referred to as indoor servants. As late as 1920, I looked at Skibbereen Eagle, it's online now, classified adverts in the Eagle occasionally stipulated a Protestant cook or maid, or Protestant preferred, but not essential. In 1917, Edith Somerville was looking for a labourer on their farm. I said, a prod preferred. And this affected the recruitment of servants for the Morroghs in Innis because no Protestant would become a servant of a Catholic family. In fact, out of the 228, there are 3 Protestants. They didn't get any higher wages. and in fact, actually, it was infra dig for a Catholic servant to take employment with a Catholic family in some ways. In Mount Music in 1919, Somerville emphasizes the indignity of being an indoor Catholic servant to a Catholic master, such as the young Larry Coppinger. In the Creed, this is a quote, in the Creed of Mary Twomey, who's a Catholic servant, but for an Anglo-Irish Protestant family. Okay, so this is the Catholic servant saying this. In the Creed of Mary Twomey and her fellows, it was only in conformity with natural law in the spiritual world that the gentry, and Gintry, the gentry should go to church, and the like of herself to chapel. The feeling of incongruity imparted by the fact of Master Larry and herself worshipping together. It was as though if she'd run into the kitchen to get a sup of hot water or the wetting of a mouth of tea, and she'd find him sitting amongst the maids in the servants' hall. Mary Twomey and her fellows would have indignantly repudiated the idea of taking service with one of their own church. No, thank God, I never sank to that, Mary once said when such had been imputed to her. There's no question of religion in it, merely of fitness, the aristocratic instinct. When the priest and philosopher George Tyrrell, incidentally, converted in the late 19th century, his mother expostulated that a son of mine should go to mass with the cook. And there are more quotes there, but I must move on. What's fascinating is that Edith personally couldn't free herself from an upbringing which distrusted Catholics. So she was very much, against the idea that there must be distrust of Catholics and so on. But she couldn't really, although she knew it was sort of wrong, she couldn't quite free herself. She had reasons, of course, politically. In 1899, after the Local Government Act of 1898, she witnessed the implacability of the sectarian divide when her brother-in-law, Cameron Somerville, failed to be elected for the local, Cameron Coghill, failed to be elected for the local council. Everybody here swore they would vote for him, but he came last in the poll. Such is the value of Roman Catholic promises. The priests resolved that no Protestants should be elected, and they have kept their word. Not one for the whole of this county has got in so far. It is an organized extermination of Protestant influence. But notice, however, that the civic-minded Somervilles are prepared to become involved in local politics. I find that quite interesting. Not the lay about uncivic-minded Morroghs. They didn't stand for anything. Catholicism, not unreasonably, was coupled with Irish nationalism. They're not quite as radical as some Anglo-Irish assumed. Violet Martin, far more unionist than Edith, assumed a Roman Catholic ascendancy and government would bring in socialism. If only. Her niece admitted that Edith Somerville had a prejudice against RCs, though when it came to individual people, both in the immediate neighbourhood and amongst her social equals, she did settle for modus vivendi. And there's a very interesting bit in the letter. At times, even Edith admitted the contortions of such a view. Assessing some visiting gentlefolk to Castle Townsend in 1918, she says this in a letter. He's a prod, I think, but she unfortunately isn't. But they're quite unlike RCs, and except on Sundays, it wouldn't make any difference. The only difficulty is remembering that there is a difficulty. It's extraordinary. She knows it's good. But the genuine Catholic aristocracy was a different matter for Edith Somerville and could be accepted or even deferred to. She visits the Kenmares in Killarney, very sort of intellectual lot as well, and is suitably impressed with them, and also with the Pale, aristocrats and the Pale round Dublin. That was all right, but Cork City Catholic bourgeoisie, like the Morroghs on the make, were a different matter. As late as the 1930s, she was still drawing broad sectarian lines. In 1935, we heard about another lecture here about King George V, didn't we? In 1935, she was tasked to collect small sums for a silver jubilee to be presented to King George V and his queen. And she writes in a letter, "No names or sums to be mentioned, only to ask those who are certain to give, no doubtfuls, RCs, etc. Brackets, though some of the better ones, O'Mara's, Morrows, etc., will I know, give willingly, and shall be asked." So despite their religion, the Morrows weren't entirely cancelled in social terms. They came close at times. The projected divorce might have knocked them out. Also the conduct of the family. They were sort of vulgar and just impossible at times. I mean, they're not... Anyhow, before her separation, Annie MacCarthy Morroghs certainly alarmed the West Cork gentry. Throughout her marriage, she was extraordinarily open about romantic episodes and her outspoken indiscretions. And this is what Edith writes in a letter. "She is the most second-rate woman I've ever met in my life," she says in 1889. Mr. Hibbert confided to Cameron, that's Edith's brother, that she had said more risky things to him in half an hour than any other woman had in all his life. His children weren't paragons either. Edith commented on the early death of the elder son. This is Bertie Morrow. "The hunting tomorrow has been put off in consequence of the sudden death of that unfortunate Bertie Morrow. I have not yet heard what they call the cause of his death, but I expect the common name of the disease was whiskey. He has led a thoroughly degraded and disgusting life for the last 7 or 8 years. And one can only hope that he may get a chance to try and start again somewhere now. That is to say, if he had a spark of soul alive to survive his miserable body. It certainly was an awful pity. I can remember him clean and smart and very handsome, but the taste for drink was born in him. He's never been taught to know right from wrong, so it's hard to blame him as much as his life would warrant." So the vulgar, energetic, noisy, and unintellectual Morrows were not at all representative of the new Catholic middle class, largely Dublin upper middle class, confident and ambitious, poised to take over the new Home Rule government in Ireland. Only to find, of course, they were outflanked by the radical nationalists of Sinn Féin once the revolution came. That's, well known a historian's argument now, Sinana, Pacitas and others' argument. Either outcome wouldn't have pleased the Unionist Anglo-Irish, nor the Morrows, actually. In the end, I think, the MacCarthy Morroghs did manage to infiltrate West Cork society, despite their hairy heels. But the irony was that they're joining a sinking ship. They never realized this and made no attempt to change it. Keith Jeffrey, that good historian, that Ulster historian, I think he's dead now, Keith Jeffrey, but Keith Jeffrey identifies the gentry officer class in Victorian Ireland as carrying, quote, "a bewildering range of cultural national baggage with them, born in Ireland, frequently educated in England, and serving the British Empire." Yet I would argue it's not really bewildering to the Morrow family. It's simply a case of both and rather than either or. They were unthinking lot, not that concerned with national identification. In that respect, they are more typical of the mass of gentry than the intellectuals and the writers from that class who worried away at national distinctions. That's it.
Mike, thank you. I think many quotes. The only difficulty being to remember there is a difficulty being to take away? There must be questions.
Can I add some small anecdote to your comments about accents?
Yes.
A famous letter. Wellington went to the school I went to in Ireland. And he was taken away by his father and sent to Eton, famously, and sent to live with his uncle with a letter in which Wellington's father said, "I'm taking the boy away from school in Ireland and sending him to Eton, as he's developing an idiosyncrasy of pronunciation which may stand against him in society." That's it.
At that time. I mean, I just don't think Morroghs, I don't think you didn't have to have that sort of restricted accent I talked about.
Can we put you in front of the mic?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
So Edith Somerville was known to have commissioned these beautiful stained glass windows at Castle Townsend, but
Harry Clark
was Catholic. So have you come across any correspondence with regards to that commission?
No, I haven't. I mean, I'm not a sort of scholar of Edith Somerville at all. I just like her books and her letters and the unpublished stuff, which is for local history. Gifford Lewis, in the large biography of Edith Somerville, very good one. It's exhaustive. She's got all these records. She's read all this unpublished material. Will probably have certainly have a reference to Harry Clark's commission. So try and get hold of that or read it. Yes.
You mentioned that one of the Morroghs kept the yacht at Greenatraw.
Yes.
Was there any family connection with Greenatraw and
No, there wasn't. This was because this is my grandfather who spent 7 or 8 years in the Royal West African Frontier Force in Nigeria. And then when he came back here, he was in the Royal Munster Fusiliers. When he came back here, he was sort of Commodore of Charles Fort in Kinsale. My father was born at Arbrack, which is a house quite close near there. And that was until about 1912. And then in 1912, his father rented the house at Durinatra, which he lived for the first 4 years. And then when his father died in 1916, he came to Inishbeg. So it was only a rented house. It wasn't a Morrough house. Yeah. I saw it just the other day. We were just trying to find it the other day because it's rather hard to get to. And then we got to it, and we couldn't sort of get in as far as we could because there's sort of keep out notices and things like that. Yeah. But it looks quite a nice house. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic house.
Yes. Sorry.
Could I just ask about Eisenhower's famous chauffeur?
Right, yes.
What relation was she? Is she? What generation was she
She's-
to your own?
Right. She's my father's sister.
That's what I wondered. Was it father or grandfather?
Yeah, no. She's the eldest. She was born in 1908. My father was born in 1912. There are 4 of that lot. And so she's my aunt.
Yes.
So I knew her fairly well. She'd come to Inishbeg occasionally with a sort of sliding mid-Atlantic accent. You know, we thought she was rather amusing and sort of teasable. We used to tease her.
You're quite a celebrity.
She was, but it's a strange form of celebrity, really. I mean, I'm surprised why people are that interested in her, to be honest, because there was gossip about her and Eisenhower, it's true. But I wrote about this for William Casey's journal. Oh, right, yes. And the zeitgeist has suddenly sort of developed more interest in her. There's been novels written about this business. She features in a play, a rather good play, called Pressure by David Haig, which I saw. I'm slightly puzzled why people are interested in her in that sense, because I just don't think that the novelists disagree, and somebody's written a sort of biography of her, which also disagrees. I don't think there was any actual leg over contact, as it were, because logistics would simply prevent that. I mean, Eisenhower had a sort of team of about 5 people he would be living cheek by jowl with throughout the war. There are times when they flew on an aeroplane from North Africa to Alexandria, where the billet doux was sort of exchanged, which is fairly unusual. And clearly they did they certainly flirted with each other, as it were, and they were, Eisenhower, I think, enjoyed her company.
Her place in what was a particular time in history, in that she originally came from Innis, and her life was at a crucial point in history with a person who was crucial
Yes,
at a set time in World War II.
That's true. I mean, he was crucial, but she wasn't. You see. Yes, I know. I agree. And so that's why, yes, I mean, Eisenhower, of course, is a historical figure. I mean, it wouldn't have mattered had they had affairs. As I say in that book, Nelson, Wellington, we wouldn't have blinked at them, the affairs they have. But no, there'd be trouble back home, because the point about it is that Eisenhower, when she wrote her first book, Eisenhower Was My Boss, which we had on the shelves at Innis, but we never really looked at it. It was ghostwritten. We were slightly embarrassed about it, actually. We thought it was a sort of silly book. But right at the end of it, she's made to say, I believe Eisenhower will make a fantastic president of the United States, that kind of thing, a sort of vulgar plug for electoral politics. So yes, to that extent, I suppose she's a minor historical figure, but very minor.
Are there any plans to republish your book on the Munster plantation?
Not that I know of, no. I mean, the trouble with that is it's a good book, of course. And I had to boil my thesis down, which was 200,000 words, into just 90,000 words. So a lot of great material is not in there. But I think people have forgotten about it slightly because it was a London thesis. I forgot to put it in the bibliography of the book, actually. I didn't sort of say, here is the London thesis. So it's got a very good appendix, I think, of the undertakers, the 35 undertakers. And I think that could be published, I suppose. But the rest of the book's out of date slightly. See, I wrote it in the 1970s and early 1980s. I finished my thesis in 1983. There's been an explosion in historical research since then. And a lot of things have been digitized. I mean, my time, you had to go to the London Record Office to look at all the state papers. And they're very badly calendared in my time, in the 1570s, 1580s. But I think it would be outflanked by more recent things, books. Yes. Well, so it should be. Yes. No plans for that. Sorry.
Did the Morroghs survive in the merchanting in Cork for any length of time?
Yes, they did. I mean, our Morroghs around, I think, still. Keith MacCarthy Morroghs around, yes, in Dublin. But there are Morroghs in Cork City, I think. The strange thing about the Morroghs in Cork City, which I've never understood, is that the Cork City, Limerick, Dublin, Galway, they're usually, of course, the Gaelic Irish were excluded from there. And you just have Anglo-Norman families, Old English families, what we call in English, or Viking families like Coppinger and Skiddy, are Viking names, Danish names, in Cork City. But the Morroghs somehow managed to get into Cork City. And there's a little alleyway named after them, and they were mayors and so on in the medieval period. Now, I've never understood quite why, because I've assumed the Morroghs were sort of originally from a Gaelic name like Morrow or something.
What was their main trade?
Main trade was things like wine and so on. I mean, the butter. Morrow's Mills, yeah. Yeah. There are quite a lot of Morrows around. I mean, they were merchants. And they traded again. They had connections with St. Malo and Lisbon and that sort of business. I know very little about this really, but there's a historian at the back who knows much more about Cork merchants and their trade. But the Morrows do exist. I mean, there was a Morrow scandal when Morrow Equity Company or some sort of finance. Right, yes, and he got into trouble, I think. I think it's because one of the people he'd hired had made outlandish sort of, and got into debt. And this person tried to pay off the debt. And I think the Morrows, presumably that collapsed. Yeah. So there are Morrows around. Yeah.
Was it MacCarthy marrying a Morrow that created the name?
Yes. Helena Morrow married James MacCarthy. And eventually the other MacCarthys died off. This is the other siblings. She's a daughter of the butter merchant. And the other MacCarthys died off. And as they died off without children, a lot of their bequests came to the Morrows, who then took on the name MacCarthy, around about 1850. And so it became MacCarthy Morroghs. Notice, though, Edith always calls them Morroghs, you see. And in fact, McRory, my suggestion, I'm sure I'm right, my suggestion that McRories are based on the Morroghs. The full name of the McRories is, say, Bertie de Lacy McRory. So I think that's a gentle sort of tilt at the recently double-barreled MacCarthy Morroghs. She's thinking, this is just typical of these rising. I mean, it's a nice fantasy. I mean, I've written again for William Case's book on this business about the McRorys being the Morroghs, and I'm sure I'm right, but I haven't got definite proof. It's annoying. But in fact, actually, somebody once said just one thing. Rosemary Salter Townsend said that in the castle at Castle Townsend, there was, I don't know if it's still there, but there certainly was a book of the RM stories, and somebody has annotated it with all the characters of these people. So if I could find that book. Yeah, that's it.
Well, Mike,
Okay.
Not self-indulgent, it was fascinating. You did a whole series of things. It was illuminating, it was funny. You've teed us up very well for David Dixon tomorrow and the discussion of mercantile history. And I think there is a very strong groundswell of support. We'll have a show of hands in a second for the republication of your